Good morning. I'll ask my co-presenters to turn their cameras on for a minute so we can see them. Um, welcome to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction webinar this morning. So we're going to split this morning into two halves. Chris is going to talk to us about the Woodland Carbon Code. He is the
Hi.
Carbon Code guru south of the border. He's our Carbon and Water Woodland Advisor in the Forestry Commission. And then we have Sam Neck joining us, and she'll run through the second half of the webinar, which will be about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee itself. Sam is a national team manager in the incentives development team in Forest Services, and she looks after various incentives, including but not limited to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So we'll keep, other than the presenters, cameras and microphones off. If I hear any noise in the background, I'll unceremoniously mute you. Don't be offended. If you have questions, please put them in the chat as we go along. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll have 10 minutes for, roughly 10 minutes for questions in each half. So if something occurs to you, pop it in the chat and we'll come back to you in question time.
Hi, everybody. Chris Waterfield from Forestry Commission. I'm going to talk about the Woodland Carbon Code, and it's going to be a very brief session, not too in-depth at all, just about what the code is and why we have it. And then if you're thinking of joining the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction, then there are a few things to know about that. So the Woodland Carbon Code is essentially about businesses and local authorities that want that have a CO2 reduction strategy and are wanting to offset those emissions, investing in new woodland created for CO2 capture. If they go through the Woodland Carbon Code, they can use those units of carbon, tons of carbon sequestered in the woodland to offset against their emissions. It's the only standard in for woodland in the UK recognised by government that allows you to do that. More on that later. So the Woodland Carbon Code uses the UK Forestry Standard, as you'd expect for a Forestry Commission and devolved authorities backed standard. The plus bit are various ISO relating to greenhouse gas removal and the reporting of those emissions reductions. Of course, for any standard, any grant even, this is not a grant, but for any standard, there are eligibility criteria. Previous land use is a big one. We ask for at least 25 years proof prior to the Woodland Carbon Code project being registered that the land was not afforested. And of course, you'll need to prove additionality. That's whether or not the project would have happened without the addition of carbon funding. Additionality, as some of you might know, is being discussed at the moment within the Woodland Carbon Code Secretariat, Advisory Board and wider fora. And it is about to change. I'm not going to go into additionality at the moment because it would take too long. But if you'd like to know more about additionality, please do look on the Woodland Carbon Code website and keep an eye on it, because as it says on this slide, this will change and projects will need to observe the additionality rules that apply at the time they validate. The code is for permanent woodland. It's covered by the Forestry Act and EIA regulations. We are looking at permanent lockdown of CO2. As long as permanency applies to woodlands, obviously they are permanent features in the landscape under the Forestry Act, but they sequester carbon, and when trees reach maturity, they begin to release carbon into the atmosphere. So they are permanent in There is a requirement to restock if losses are due to wind, fire, pest, disease and development. You can predict your carbon sequestration using tools on the website, using the methodology developed by Forest Research. This validation and verification allows you to make carbon statements and report your CO2 capture against your CO2 emissions, of course. But obviously we all know that woodland creation isn't just about carbon capture. There are social and environmental benefits of woodland, which are many and too many to mention in the 20 minutes presentation. Moving on. Okay, so the regulations that apply are the UK Forestry Standard, the Forestry Act and Environmental Impact Assessment. If your woodland creation project is subject to a grant or being given a grant in order to make it happen, you can still apply for the Woodland Carbon Code, and the Forestry Commission in England will ensure that you meet the EIA impact assessments and that your woodland is UKFS compliant. I say we will make sure that it meets. You and we will make sure that it meets those regulations. It's a simple principle for big science. As trees grow, they capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You can see that the curve described by the green dashed line is essentially the carbon dioxide that is being sequestered into a woodland over lifetime. Although the axis on the bottom, the x-axis, just finishes at 35 years there. You can imagine that dashed line would go on up to 100 years, and then start to, as trees start to mature, it flatlines out. So every carbon capture project that is registered under the Woodland Carbon Code is for 100 years. We can predict relatively accurately the carbon sequestration that occurs over a 100-year period. Over that time period of 100 years, you need to ensure that you are going to verify the project's carbon sequestration if it's going to comply with the Woodland Carbon Code. And again, so we're talking about connecting landowners, people who have woodlands, people who are wanting to create new woodlands with businesses that are looking to offset emissions. And hopefully that will bring you, the landowner, you, the land manager, some new income in through carbon sequestration and the sale of units of carbon. The UK Land Carbon Registry is a register for all Woodland Carbon Code projects. It's also a registry for all peatland Carbon Code projects. And it holds all the units that are registered and the documentation that goes alongside them. You can track the issuance of units. That's when a project is validated or when a project is verified. That process of issuance of the unit to the person that has bought it occurs. There's a small fee for doing that. That helps us to run the registry. You can track ownership and you can track transfer and use of those units. 1 tonne of CO2 is 1 PIU. You'll hear that term discussed when people are talking about woodland carbon, and that in turn is equal to a WCU. The difference is time. A PIU is a promissory note to deliver. It's not a guaranteed carbon unit. It's in most instances, it's a stick in the ground surrounded by a tree tube of some sort. And you can only make a corporate social responsibility statement about future sequestration on a PIU. When it's converted upon verification, it becomes a woodland carbon unit. This is actual measured sequestration. It's a guaranteed carbon unit, and it can be used to offset and compensate for emissions. During the process of validation, you will put some of your PIUs and therefore some of your WCUs into what's known as a buffer. That buffer is an insurance policy which will help if your woodland suffers from fire, pest or disease to cover the units that you have already issued. Validation and verification. Validation happens at the outset after you've put your last tree in the ground, and verification happens throughout the project along with monitoring, which you would do every 5 or 10 years, depending on how you're going to verify. Remembering, therefore, then that verification is an ongoing cost and needs to be figured into your cost for carbon if you are going into the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. You remember I talked about ISOs earlier on. Those are the ISOs that are covered by the Woodland Carbon Code and the extras that make it the UK Forestry Standard Plus. So those relate to, as I said, greenhouse gas reporting and making statements. The verifiers and validators currently available for the Woodland Carbon Code are the Soil Association and the Organic Farmers and Growers. So I've lost my button. So what do you need to register your project for the Woodland Carbon Code and therefore the Woodland Carbon Guarantee? I should point out that registration for the Woodland Carbon Code is free, but you do need to supply a map. The map needs to have a scale, a key, a north arrow, a boundary defining the project area. That's the project area as you register it, which may be different to the project area after you've been through the Woodland Carbon Guarantee and Woodland Carbon Code registration process and then EIA. You need to give a grid reference. It's up to you. You can give a 6-figure or an 8-figure grid reference, but make sure it's accurate. Make sure you aren't trying to place your woodland in the middle of the North Sea, or the Irish Sea, or the Channel for that matter. Put a name on your project area and give a name of the person who's registering. The other thing you need to do is to work out an approximate value for the number of tonnes of CO2 sequestered. You can use the Woodland Carbon Code's calculator to do this, but you don't have to do it in as much detail as you will have to do when you are validating the project. The Forestry Commission expects, and Scottish Forestry and Natural Resources Wales and the Northern Ireland Forest Service all expect that projects will change over the course of an EIA notification and through to approval of grant. So we expect that your project, when you register it for the Woodland Carbon Code, will change by the time you've got to the bottom. That's the point of doing a validation afterwards, so that you know exactly, roughly, sort of, how many Woodland Carbon Code units you're going to sequester in your project. So that's the end of my part, Sam. I'd just like to ask if anybody's got any questions.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got a couple that have come through so far. So Ewan Nugent from Natural England has asked if the improved payment rates under the England Woodland Creation Offer affect additionality for the Carbon Code.
Thanks, Ewan. That's a good question. It's one that I get asked quite a lot. It shouldn't affect your project because we're looking over a 100-year period, and the additional contributions are paid in the first 10 years. of a project's existence. So we look at whether you are able to cover the costs of establishment, but obviously there are costs of management and costs of managing the woodland, managing people in the woodland, costs of verification throughout the project. And those will often outweigh the costs that you might see at establishment time. And remember that we're talking about incomes as well. And any incomes that come into a project actually do have an effect on additionality when you're looking at the financial additionality tests. But in the main, a broadleaf woodland that's being established in England won't make much money. I'm going to say much money, not any money, before the end of the carbon project period. So you can be pretty sure that a broadleaf woodland being created in England at the average size that a broadleaf woodland gets created in England will pass an additionality test. It's the commercial woodlands that may not need the funding that we need to make sure and double check that they really are additional.
It's probably worth saying as well that when we designed UCO, we had in mind that we didn't want to in any way undermine carbon markets and the carbon code, so it was designed to leave room for additionality from the beginning.
I always forget that bit.
Angus Wells has asked a couple of questions that are related, and to avoid the risk of me mangling that, I was going to invite Angus to come off mute and ask
Brilliant.
your question of Chris.
Hi there, thank you. Yeah, it's just to ask about the pending issuance units. So if the verification shows that the number of units being generated is more than were applied for at the time of application, are those excess units available, or are those kind of lost? Because obviously at the time of application it's based on like yield classes and things like that. It
is, yeah, entirely. It's a really good question, that one that gets asked quite frequently, but thanks for asking it again, Angus. The simple answer is that they are available to you, but only after you've verified. So they would be available to you as woodland carbon units to sell straight there and then as sequestered carbon. They wouldn't be PIUs because you're not repredicting across the rest of the project. What you're doing is you're looking at verification and saying, is the difference between what I predicted at PIU stage different to the verification point? If it is, and you've got a surplus, yes, you could probably sell those surplus units. If it's the other way round, obviously there may be a different issue, and you may be thinking, have I got to pay somebody back? Which is why it's probably not wise to say, okay, our project's predicted to work to be going much higher than this. Validation is about validating the prediction. Have you used the model right? Have you predicted correctly? At verification is the time when you're finding whether your prediction was right. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Okay, superb.
Great. And then we've got some questions from Nick Donoghue about the units. Nick, do you want to ask your question of Chris?
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. I was just wondering, if you're registering, obviously that has to be done before the trees are planted, doesn't it? So yeah, at that point, won't the tons of carbon equivalent sequestered, that will be zero, won't it?
At the point of
that you register.
At the point of registration, yeah, they will be zero because you won't have planted anything. What you're doing is saying, I am about to plant, or I am about to plant a project. I am predicting that this project will sequester X, because you know roughly what you might do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the registration is a pre-validating figure. It's
Thank you. Sorry if that's a rather simple question.
No,
I
no,
didn't
you're
realise you were
absolutely
making
fine. There is no such thing, Nick, as a simple question. Ever.
And
Not in this world.
Is that when do you make the prediction though? At what is it? Say I'm going to say it's going to be this at 10 years or over the lifetime of 100.
You're making the prediction for the lifetime of the project.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And it's really easy to do on the Woodland Carbon Code calculator.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Can I ask one other thing then about units? Is a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent the same as a ton in biomass?
It's not, no.
I didn't think it would be so simple.
It's not, no, because it's all to do with atomic weight. The chemical formula for carbon dioxide obviously is CO2, which means that for every carbon atom there's an oxygen or two oxygen atoms, which makes its atomic weight. I think it's something like 3.4 times more than a carbon atom on its own.
Okay.
So what we're doing is predicting the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming down, which is a heavier weight than the amount of carbon that is sequestered into the tree.
So if I've understood
it's about. Sorry.
No, sorry. Go on.
Well, I was going to say the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon is about a third. The carbon is about a third of the amount of carbon dioxide tonnage that you'll draw down.
Okay, thank you. So if you had a tree that weighed 2 tons overall, then obviously you're talking roughly 50% carbon in that biomass when dry, and then that's about a third of the CO2 that you've drawn down.
About that, yes.
Yeah, thank you. It's just to give a rough idea to farmers and owners that I'm talking to.
That's fine, no problem at all. That's a relatively good and accurate way of doing it. It's as accurate as anybody else is going to be.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
No problem.
So we've got a question from Nick Prince. Can carbon credits be claimed for woodland that's generated through natural colonisation? And if not, is that something that's being considered for future?
I don't know whether that's a setup question or not, but it's a good one. Yes, it can, Nick. We can allow natural colonisation into the Woodland Carbon Code. We can't, though, allow you to make any predictions at either registration or at the registration point, and validation can't happen for 5 years after you've registered, because we need to see what is actually coming up on site. You may be saying, well, I know what's going to come up here, it's going to be X, Y and Z species, and they're going to grow at this rate. Well, until something actually does come up on site, we can't allow you to make a prediction. But when you do, it's the same process. You get validated and then you go through verification. Is that okay, Nick?
That's great, thanks. It wasn't a setup. Right. Thank you.
No, I didn't. I was joking. Thanks for asking.
Great. And then Luke Hemmings has asked, when's the code going to be updated to reflect the carbon stored in productive timber and the offset value of using less polluting materials than steel or concrete?
That's a good question. I could give you a really straightforward answer, Luke. It's not. The hardwood products will have to be in a different code because they are what you're doing there is looking at the carbon sequestered in a new woodland, because it would have to be a brand new woodland, and then you would have to be making the prediction at year 0 for trees that are growing and going to, let's say, be felled at year 40 or year 60 or year 50, and knowing where that market is going to be, and then saying, okay, well, that's what it's going to be used for. So it's really, it's quite difficult. It isn't impossible, but it's not going to be in the Woodland Carbon Code. What might be within the Woodland Carbon Code are changes to management practices that lead to more carbon sequestered. But even that we haven't decided on whether it's going to be there. I think it's been long recognised that the hardwood products, or the harvested wood products, part of substitution for concrete and steel is a really useful piece to happen. But at the moment, all it could be would be substituting the number of tons of carbon the number of tons of carbon you're using in steel for timber, which is a different thing to what the Woodland Carbon Code is looking at. What we need, and I am reaching out, is for people in the industry to start saying, we will start to deliver, we will start to make this code. If anybody is interested, the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund is available for doing projects just like that, for developing new codes that look at carbon. We need a substitution code because we need to show how important timber is in the world of construction. I hope that helps, Luke. I'm happy to talk to you about it and how you might move that forwards.
All right, thanks, Chris. And then we've got some good questions from Paul Clark about woodland carbon units and how they work. Paul, do you want to come off mute and ask your questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Certainly can.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I struggle to grasp quite what the woodland carbon unit is, in the sense of, is it time limited? I've got, say I plant some trees and I've got this idea that I'm going to have this many credits, and so I don't know at what point I can sell them. And if I don't sell them, can I just sit on them, say for 20 years, and they'll still be there to sell if I don't like the price now? You know, can I see them as a long-term asset, or do I have to sell them within, say, 5 years period, or they disappear?
No. Right. I'll take your question in parts.
Thank you. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a muddle.
That's all right, no problem. At the beginning of the project, you're predicting the amount of carbon that you're going to sequester in a woodland. And that prediction is valid for until you start to verify it. And you could sell that predicted carbon upfront, all of it, all in one go, and say, I'm selling the PIUs to whoever it is, let's say the co-op, for example, selling the PIUs to the co-op. You have a 100-year contract with the co-op, therefore, to provide them with WCUs and to verify them.
Right.
What you could do, which you can see, and I phrased that and emphasised that in a way that might make you think it's not such a good idea to do. What you might do is sell a few that you need in order to get a little bit of liquidity to help with the project. Say the first 10 years worth of your carbon code project as upfront units, PIUs, and deliver them on year 10.
So that would be on the basis of the verification at year 10.
That would be on the basis, yeah, on the basis of verification at year 10. You would be able to convert your year 0 to year 10 prediction as WCUs, however many there are, and then you'd be able to say, okay, from now on, I'm going to sit on my units because I don't like the price, or actually I wanted this for an investment for grandkids and they're not going to need it for the next 20 years, so I'll sit on the units until I want to sell them at year 30, let's say, or year 20. They are still there, they're sequestered, as long as you verify them. And if it's not assigned to anybody when they're verified, then you can keep them and they don't get retired straight away. If they're assigned to somebody at the point of verification, what happens is that person is assumed to want to use them. And so they are taken from being a predicted carbon unit to a woodland carbon unit, and then they are assigned across to, or rather they are retired by the person who they are assigned to. And it is assumed that in retirement, those units, they don't go to a retirement home, but in those units are being used to report against carbon emissions.
Right.
So you can your units, you could sit on your units, you could do something completely different and say, right, I'm going to get my project validated, and I'm going to verify it at years 5, 15, 25, and it's not going to be until year 25 that I sell any of them.
Right.
Because I want the money to help me out with doing my first thinning.
Right, and I would then get the price at the time, at year 25. If I sell now, I get a price I can negotiate now.
Yeah, and if you go into the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, you get a price every 5 years from the government, which is fixed now but rises with inflation. And Sam's going to tell you a little bit more about that later on.
Right. Okay.
Great segue. Sorry, Paul. Go
Sorry,
on.
do I need to? My question was going to be, if I have a fire at year 15 and lose trees or damage or that, I understand from what you're saying, I've got to replace in order to keep that going, but I don't actually have to compensate anybody on the money I've had in for their carbon units, as long as I make good the damage.
If you have, if you've actually released woodland carbon units to somebody else, what you do is you make a claim on the Woodland Carbon Code's buffer, and those units are used to replace the ones which you which you have issued already. That's why it's like an insurance policy.
Right. So it's not a personal cost to me, but it's a.
It shouldn't be. You will be responsible for replanting the areas that are damaged, but the units, as far as the code is concerned, the units come from the buffer and they go, which is a pooled buffer for the whole of the Woodland Carbon Code. Right. And you'll take your 15, 20, 30 units, or however many it is, and you'll say, right, actually, those units are the units you're using now, not the ones you got from me.
Right. Okay. And the system put inside those.
You're ready. Sorry, I should say, until such times as you're ready to start issuing units again on your project, you're using other people's units. That's how it works.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No problem.
There is one more question about selling PRUs in the chat, Chris. I wonder if you could answer it in the chat. And
I will do. I'll answer it in the chat because I think we need to move on.
We'll move on, to Sam and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee.
Yeah, thanks. Are you able to move the slides on to the next one, Chris? Thank you. So yeah, I'm just going to talk to you about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee off the back of the first session on the Carbon Code. So the Carbon Guarantee is underpinned fully by the Carbon Code. The origins of the Carbon Guarantee came from the 25-year Environment Plan. So back in 2018, that was published, and it set out that there should be a guarantee put in place to basically share the risk around woodland creation and to try and bring forward and encourage further investment in woodland creation. So after the announcements in 2018, the Carbon Guarantee launched with its first auction in late 2019, early 2020, as I say, with that core aim of driving woodland creation and to try and develop the private sector woodland carbon market. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So a bit of basic information about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. While it's not a grant scheme, it's an additional income stream. So it's payments for outcomes. We aren't, unlike UCO, giving any money for the actual planting or maintenance of a woodland. It is purely about those carbon units. The Carbon Guarantee itself has a budget of £50 million, and we plan to run 2 auctions per year over a 4 or 5 year period. We issue up to 35-year contracts The actual duration of the contract will depend upon the day that the project commences, but it will go up to 35 years. And then during that period, we'll offer guaranteed payments for the woodland carbon units as the trees grow and are verified. The real key to this, as I've already mentioned, is the Woodland Carbon Code. So the guarantee is completely linked and underpinned by it. And all the projects that come into the carbon guarantee must have first registered with the carbon code. And then you wouldn't get a final carbon guarantee offer until a site has been validated. And then equally, payments from the carbon guarantee would be linked to verification under the carbon code. Chris has already talked about additionality in light of new grant schemes, in particular the England Woodland Creation Offer, which does have a number of additional contributions and payments, but it doesn't have one for carbon. As I think Sam mentioned, that's a conscious decision in the design of UCO because we have these existing mechanisms in place through the carbon code and the carbon guarantee. However, if you are applying for UCO, part of the application form is synchronized with the registration for the Woodland Carbon Code, and you can sort of lift and shift information across to try and simplify that as far as possible. I'm going to talk more about the process on the next slide, but the carbon guarantee does run through a reverse auction, and I'll come on to that in more detail as we move on to the next slides. Thanks, Chris. So some basics on eligibility. What I would say is we have a gov.uk page, which I'd encourage you to visit for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. There is a guide for the next auction already up on that webpage, which contains useful information, but there's also more about eligibility, but some key points to be aware of. You can't include land within the carbon guarantee that's covered by a requirement to restock. The land has to be entirely within England because it's an England scheme. You have to have management control of the land, and it's not available for public bodies. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so I think this is a slide where I can set out a bit more about how the process works in sort of step by step. So as I say, the first thing that needs to happen is registration with the Woodland Carbon Code. That's really important because without that, you wouldn't be able to apply for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So you go through the registration process as Chris set out. You would then complete an application form for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee and send that into us. We would carry out some eligibility checks on that application, and we would then issue you with a PIN, a unique PIN code, and you would use that PIN code to participate in the auction. The auction dates are also on gov.uk, and the auction itself will run for 7 days. So during that 7-day period, you would need to go onto the auction platform using your unique PIN number and then place your bid into the auction. Once the auction finishes, we will review the bids, and we aim to notify anyone who's taken part in the auction whether they've been successful within a 2-week period after the auction closes. Once you have that information to hand, you'll get a conditional offer if you've been successful, and it's conditional upon validation under the Woodland Carbon Code. So that's then the next part of the journey. You would go off, get your regulatory consent, plant your woodland, and then have it validated. Once it's been validated under the Woodland Carbon Code, you would then get your final offer from the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. As I say, the two are completely interlinked. So then as you go through that verification process with the Woodland Carbon Code, in whatever increments it might be, 5-year, 10-year increments, at those verification points, you have the option to sell those verified units to government at your agreed price that was determined through the auction process. But it is just that it's an option. It's almost like a fallback. I think, you know, you're not obligated at all to sell to government. You can sell on the private market in many that's almost the aspiration of to buoy the private carbon market so that the units are sold elsewhere, but you have this fallback position to sell to government through the carbon guarantee. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we are now coming up for our 5th auction under the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. And if you want to take part, there are a few parameters to be aware of. So the budget for the next auction is 10 million, so quite a healthy pot of money available. We do have in place prices. We have in auction 5 got 2 separate prices, one for predominantly native and a second lower price for other project types. The reason that we have done that is because we know higher for predominantly native projects, and we want to make sure we get a good spread of project types coming into. When we look at the auction bids, we sort them firstly by the price, so we wouldn't support any bids that come in over our reserve price. We then take out the top 10% most expensive woodland carbon units. Again, that's in there for competitive purposes. And then we also have in this auction a list of eligible species, which we haven't had in previous auctions. The full list is in the guide to auction 5 upon UK. So yeah, it's available for you to look through. I don't think there should be any surprises because it aligns with other eligible species lists that you would see elsewhere within the Forestry Commission, for example, the England Woodland Creation Offer. But as I say, yeah, it's published and there for you to refer to before putting in your application to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. If I could have the next slide.
Sam, I don't know if it's just me, but you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it's your connection. You might want to turn your video off.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I'll do that. Yeah, apologies if my sound isn't great. Okay, couple more points to run through. So I mentioned there that we have 2 separate reserve prices, one for predominantly native and one for any other woodland type. So I thought it worth mentioning what we define as predominantly native. So that's at least 60% of the net area has native woodland as defined by the Ancient and Native Woodland Practice Guide, and you can see on the bullet points there a bit more information about what that practice guide requires, and then of course the other 40% of the net area could be other woodland types. It wouldn't need to be native. Next slide, please. So some key dates for auction 5. We are open for applications at the moment, but of course it's important to first remember to register with the Woodland Carbon Code before you put in your application to take part in the auction. The deadline for getting your application into the Carbon Guarantee is the 24th of April. The auction itself will then take place from the 9th of May running through until the 15th of May. The reason we have a 2-week gap between the application deadline and the auction taking place is to give us sufficient time to process any applications that come in, to carry out our checks to make sure the projects are registered with the Carbon Code, and also to send out those unique PIN numbers for applicants to take part in the auction. This, as I say, is our 5th auction, but we are planning another auction later in the year. Exact dates to be confirmed, but it will be November 2022. And then I've just got one more slide. Thanks. So I thought it worth putting up on screen what the average successful bid prices for woodland carbon units have been in the 4 auctions that have been held to date. Again, this information is on gov.uk in our guide to auction 5, if you want to have a look at that. I think it has to come with the health warning that you can see on screen, that these aren't sort of a firm indicator of acceptable bids. The auction is competitive, but it does give an idea of what has been successful in previous auctions. Okay, I think that's the end of my slides. I don't know if any questions came through.
So we haven't had any in the chat. Gareth asked to see a sample contract, and we've put the link to gov.uk in there. Okay, here's one from Peter Solly. So projects need to be registered with the Woodland Carbon Code before planting. Does it also need to enter an auction before planting, or can that be done afterwards?
Yes, so you have to go through the auction process before planting. So all of that has to be done ahead of any planting taking place.
Thanks, Sam. Are there any more questions? I'm happy if folks want to raise hands. You don't have to type it in the chat.
Sam, I think I'll just say I'm also happy for people to ask me questions on my email. Outside of this, if you're feeling like you don't want to talk out loud to voice your question, if you want to contact me, then please do on my Forestry Commission email.
Great. So we'll just wait and see if any more questions come through. Paul.
Yes, hello, me again. This query is, if you put this in to enter the auction before you plant, clearly, what if you then decide not to plant? Does that matter?
Well, you're not obligated, so no, there wouldn't be any comeback, essentially, for want of a better word. We would ask that you obviously keep us updated on your project plans, but no, there wouldn't be a penalty.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We've got another question from Sam Hagan. So for projects that have been registered prior to the change in rules and are already planted but not yet validated, are these still eligible for the auction?
No, so projects that are coming into the auction would need to be at that earlier stage in the process. So yeah, unfortunately, the answer is no on that one.
So the headline is if it's planted, it's not eligible. We've got one from Angus Wells. What's the approximate balance? What has the approximate balance been of successful bids between native broadleaf versus other woodlands in the auctions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have gone through a period of development with the carbon guarantee, and that's reflected in the introduction of having these essentially 2 separate pots. We were seeing some skewing towards certain woodland types, and obviously we want the auction to be fair for all, and in response to that we've introduced these separate reserve prices, which has smoothed out the types of project that are successful at auction. Yeah, so we are sort of responsive. We analyse the results after each auction and then update and change the parameters accordingly.
Thanks, Sam. Not seeing any more hands. Oh, no, and no more questions in the chat. So one last call for questions. And if not, like Chris said, you can always follow up with the presenters if you have questions. We can call it a day early. Oh, Nick, go for it.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just got in at the end. Hi, Sam. Do you have to be selling WCUs in the auction? I know obviously you're saying you register with it immediately before even planting, but when you actually come to realise that, is it a WCU or is it a PIU?
Hi, Nick. Sorry, I'm just
Oh, yeah.
having a slight coughing fit. Just 1 moment.
No worries.
Nick, I think I can answer that for Sam, unless she's finished her coughing fit. What you're selling, what you're promising to sell the government is WCUs at verification. We take a prediction of your PIUs, but we don't buy the PIUs. We only buy at the point of verification. So we are effectively buying a WCU from you.
Right. Thank you.
And what that allows you to do, of course, is to say, well, at verification, the price is now twice or a third more than the price I agreed with government. I'll sell in the private market.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
And if you're back, Sam, I've got another question. Can coppice be eligible?
Oh, my leaning is no, but I think I'm going to have to
Do you want me to have a go?
think about that. Yeah, sure. If you have the answer, Chris.
Coppice
Go
is
for it.
treated in the Woodland Carbon Code. It's coppice is treated as a productive form of woodland management. So you would put it through the Woodland Carbon Code with a cap at whenever you were going to coppice the woodland, and you'd be able to sell the units that have been made up until that time. But to be honest, you just like if it was a commercial woodland, you'd need to be proving additionality, but also you do get a capped number of units over the whole period of time. It could be worthwhile doing. It just depends on your calculations. But obviously, sorry, just to carry on for a little bit longer, the woodland that you create would need to be UKFS compliant, species wise, and so single monoculture coppice probably wouldn't achieve UKFS. But if it's a variety of different types of hazel, let's say, or other, then you may well get through UKFS. Does that help? I hope it does.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, well, yeah, Matt says thanks. Thanks, Chris. So I think if there are no more questions, it's just left for me to thank Chris and Sam. I think you give really clear explanations of how the Woodland Carbon Code and Woodland Carbon Guarantee work separately and together. And thanks for answering those questions that we got. I hope it's been useful to everybody who's attended, and we'll look forward to your registrations and applications. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, everybody. See you soon.